Thank you very much. Right, similarly, technologically adept, as you can see. I'm just going to... There we go. Okay, hello everybody. I have worked for Ecology for the last 12, 13 years now in business development, and as Andy says, we spend a lot of our time working with community land trusts and groups, co-housing, housing co-ops, tackling this issue of affordable homes. I also work with our mortgage team, who spend a lot of time funding self-build schemes, such as the project that Bruce has just been describing to us. So it's kind of nice to follow Bruce and Maddie and talk a little bit about what we do, but also hopefully just in the brief time we've got, just share a few tips and ideas as well. So for those of you who don't know much about or anything about Ecology Building Society, we've been around since 1981. We're still the youngest building society in the country, which is a bit sad really. But we were created by a group of people who could be sat in this room now because they were frustrated at the lack of options offered by the finance community to help build projects and properties that challenge the status quo that the major house builders provide. So we had an initial focus really on low impact living, and we've grown literally from a 2 up, 2 down savings and mortgages in a little terraced house in West Yorkshire to having our own offices and growing organically to now having a mortgage book of about 145 million. Members just over 10,000 now. And I suppose the key is, unlike regional building societies, we lend right across the UK, but we'll only lend for projects that have a positive impact on land and the built environment. So for new build, that means energy efficient design. For retrofit and renovation conversion projects, that means that sustainability really needs to be built in to the ethos of the scheme. For community-led housing, somebody asked me downstairs earlier, why are you looking at that? Well, I haven't come across a CLT or a co-housing group or a group self-build scheme that doesn't want to build sustainably. They all do. It's absentee ownership of local shops and things like that to try and help sustain communities and stop them becoming theme parks that nobody can avoid to live in if they grew up there. That's where we are. We're in West Yorkshire in Silsden. So we've now graduated from the 2 up, 2 down. And we're doing our best to practice what we preach with our offices. So a little bit about what we do. As I've explained, we do self-build, we do all sorts really, energy efficient conversions. It doesn't have to be a grand designs project. It can be a simple Victorian terrace that needs a bit of TLC to improve its thermal efficiency. And I'll explain a bit how we price for those types of projects in a moment. And we do all of those different weird and wonderful community-led housing types of projects, including the most recent one, a mutual home ownership society, which I haven't got time to go into now, and would take about 3 hours. And also rural housing burden homes up in Scotland as well. So the way we try and price our mortgages is to provide pricing that's linked to the environmental standards, the social impact, as well as the financial risk. So for community schemes, we have a range of rates between 3 and 5 over base at the moment, depending on what it is. And for residential, we have a standard variable rate of 4.65 that is then discounted against the standards that are being achieved. And that includes renovations as well as new build. I'll show you a slide on it in a moment. So if we're working with groups, we can lend both for the development phase, acquiring the site, subject to outline planning consent and subject to sustainable design. We can lend up to a couple of million as our maximum. We can't go more than that because our regulator will shout at us, but that's as far as we can go. And up to 80% on a stage payment basis, releasing funds as the site value improves. And that's true also of self-build mortgage for individuals, although we don't tend to get asked for 2 million quid on an individual house. So we work really backwards on the cash flow from what the projected value would be to make sure that you can release not only the funds that you need at the stage you need them, but also obviously the overall affordability of the scheme is worked out in advance so that you know where you're going and what's available. We have worked with groups, as Maddie was saying, Patterdale have decided to rent their homes in perpetuity. Some groups will look at offering shared ownership or selling properties at a percentage of open market value, for example. So we've done mortgages on those as well. And I think the key is, if you're a group looking to do something like that, talk to lenders that understand what you're about, because unfortunately some of the big volume lenders perhaps don't have the systems in place to handle something that's a bit more complex and a bit more bespoke. They tend to like everything going through their computer says no funnel. So we're kind of small enough and edgy enough, I suppose, to look at that kind of thing. And if it isn't going to work, if the documentation really is that severe that we can't lend, the chances are you can't get mortgages on it. So just very briefly, the table on the left there, the discounts that we offer range from 0.5% off our standard variable rate through to 1.25% off, and that applies to all our borrowers who've done a project with us once the project is completed. This table is particularly relevant to new build, so we won't lend if it's less than EPC-B on new build. We'll recognise passive house at the top end. Code for Sustainable Homes in old money, that's not a live planning standard anymore, but we still see that in Section 106 agreements from various local authorities. And the AECB, which I think there's some information on in your packs, the Association of Environmentally Conscious Builders, have a standard as well for retrofit and for new build, which we recognise. A few tips. Okay. I think this has been eloquently described by Bruce earlier with his own project, really, and from the horse's mouth, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but obviously knowing your budgets, whether you're a group or a self-build individual, is important. Being realistic. Stress testing your assumptions about the plot, the labour costs, materials. Interest rates, are they going to stay where they are? How long is the project going to take? Can you afford it if the rates move? Because fixed rates are not going to be available on a self-build, pretty much. It's going to be variable rate. And cash flow, which is absolutely critical for any project. Working with designers and contractors that understand what you're about and what you're looking for. And if you are working to the Passive House standard, particularly airtight, thermally efficient home, do that from the start. It's not something that you can really design back into the project halfway through. It needs to be Passive House planned. If you're a group, think about those terms of leases. Are they practical? Will funders be okay with them? Talk to lenders at an early stage rather than producing a lease document and then wondering why people can't get mortgages on your scheme and your cash flow is absolutely suffering because you're paying interest for longer than you thought. Talk to valuers too, and ask the lenders you're working with if they've got a panel or whether they're happy to work with a local firm that knows what you're about. It's important because they need to understand, particularly with some of the community-led housing projects, how to value some of those projects because they've got restrictive covenants on. They won't be valued at open market value. So, worth doing all of the above. Ask about loan-to-value ratios. We can lend it up to 80% of value, as I mentioned, but some lenders are more circumspect than that. Others will offer a higher one, but look at what fees they're charging, what interest rate they're charging for that privilege. There are some self-build lenders, for example, who will do what we call an accelerator mortgage, and they're lending funding and if you like, speculating on what your project's going to be worth and lending at that stage to get you over the line, whereas we tend to lend in arrears, in other words, against the value of what's already on site. So that might be useful, even though it might be a bit more expensive for people who are considering doing off-site construction, for example, where you've got quite high initial costs and there's nothing on site to value, and suddenly pretty much everything's on site to value. So you might need if you like, a bridge of a mortgage to get to that point. Projected income isn't something that regulated residential mortgage underwriters will take into account. They'll base it on your average income over the last 3 years. If you're self-employed, they'll want to see SA 302s and average that out. Sweat equity, it's great to see that people want to put sweat equity into their project, whether it's a self-build or whether it's a community build, and people want to invest a little bit in it. But it doesn't necessarily equate to a similar increase in value. What tends to happen is your value goes up gradually in the early stages of the build and tends to sort of hockey stick up towards the end when you're getting very close to it being a saleable asset. And finally, whatever you do, choose partners that understand what you're doing. And when you mention community self-build or community land trusts or mutual home ownership, that they don't look at you like you've got 3 heads. I don't think we've got time for questions right now, but thank you very much for listening.